Hello, welcome to Loremaster's Library. I'm the Loremaster, here to continue our examinations of the history of Asian countries, to give game masters and players alike possible inspiration for an Asian-inspired game. This week, we continue on with one viewers are likely to know less about, Korea. When speaking of Korea, especially after the time they were occupied by Japan and had attempts at their history destroyed, it is important to speak of the prehistoric eras of Korea. These are usually broken down into three periods: the Joseon period, the Mumun period, and the Samhan period. Joseon started in around 8000 BC and is known through various pottery pieces during its time. The Mumun was the Bronze Age, though bronze artifacts are rarely found, but enough relics are found to show that it was an intensively agricultural society. Finally, the Samhan, or Three Han, was the early Iron Age, and at this time rose three kingdoms which were the prototypes for the later three kingdoms: the Byeon Han, Jin Han, and Ma Han. But let's not act like these three overall categories supersede everything which happened on the peninsula during the ancient period. There were kingdoms of note established during these times, the first of which is Jeju-Seon, said to have been established in 2333 BC by the legendary Dagon, and re-established later in a new dynasty by a refugee of China's Shang dynasty, as it was conquered by the Zhou. The kingdom's existence was in the Mumun period, and the nation produced the Mumun pottery, bronze tools, and some poetry which made its way back to China. It was around China's Han period when another refugee, Wei Man, took the throne of Gojoseon, only to have the Han chase him down 100 years later, and the nation was conquered, part of it becoming part of China and the other splitting into successive states of the pre-Three Kingdoms. Also during this time period was the Kingdom of Jin, which occupied southern Korea from the 4th century BC to about the 2nd century, breaking apart at around the same time as the rule of Wei Man. And yes, there was a time, 2,000 years ago, when there was a North and South Korea, though it was divided at a different spot. Still, wild, right? Either way, but there was no agreement to why the Jin eventually ended. There are various artifacts from that time, including those which look similar to Yayoi Japan, leading to the theories that Yayoi was not named for Japan. See last week's video for more on that. With both these ancient nations fractured, we have an era of the peninsula being fractured into several states, collectively known as the pre-Three Kingdoms era. North had the states of Byeon, Goguryeo, Okjeo, let me say that one again, Okjeo, and Dongri, while the south had the three Samhan states stated earlier. These 20 years are mostly known for ironworking and trade, considered more of a stopgap between the three kingdoms which eventually took over all the neighbors, around the year 300. The kingdoms would eventually rise, but they started as fragmented kingdoms, like their neighbors. The first, and the farthest to north, was Goguryeo, founded by the hero king Jumon, known for his skills with archery. As it continued to expand and consume its neighbors, eventually Goguryeo would find itself bumping into the territory of the Chinese Three Kingdoms, specifically into the Wei territory. This eventually led to wars between the two, but with a Goguryeo victory, bringing an age of peace around the year 300. Culture-wise, it was the Goguryeo who invented kimchi, and singing and dancing were popular at the time, a tradition some K-pop stars say has continued unbroken to this day. Other marks adapted by the later United Korea include the clothing called a hanbok, the fighting styles of the Syrium and Take. One moment, I have the word here. Taekeion, close enough, and the Ondol floor heating system. That's right, heated floors around the year 300. Wild, right? The second of the kingdoms, Bakje, was on the southwestern coast of the peninsula. While it was much smaller than Goguryeo, it had the highest population at 3,800,000, similar to Goguryon's 3,500,000. The nation was composed of both native Yamek and the Han Chinese, and was founded as one of the successors to Goguryeo. The nation, with its coastal location, was mostly sea-based, both with a large navy as well as trade ships which conducted diplomacy with China and Japan, taking the Chinese culture from the former and trading it to the latter in exchange for military aid. This, of course, was also an important stop on the spread of Buddhism. Smaller population-wise was Silla. Starting as one of the chiefdoms of the Sam-Han Confederacy, starting as a city-state and slowly observing the other city-states and chiefdoms until around the year 300, when it stood alone as a monarchy. Well, as one of three, but you know what I'm trying to say. There were two main religions at the time in Silla: the state religion of Buddhism and the more shamanistic native practices, which both the government practice and different orders were built around. Also of the three kingdoms, it is the one which had its own writing preserved the best, giving us a better idea of the ways of the kingdom's history. Silla was also known for diplomacy, having allies as near as China and as far as Iran. However, Japan claimed that it was Tokugawa Sano who was the founder of Silla, which set up many wars with Japan trying to claim the region in the future. But around the 6th century, the power balance was shifted. Silla made an alliance with the Tang Empire and conquered both Bakje and southern Goguryeo. This began what is known as the Southern and Northern periods, also known as the second time in Korea's history it was split into North and South. To the south was what was known as Unified Silla, who used this time to create a golden age of arts and religion, this being the time when Korea's Mount Jurihua, I'm not going to pronounce it right, was made into one of the four sacred mountains of Chinese Buddhism. They were also highly advanced in science. While they did not invent gunpowder like China, they did have enough skill with astronomy to be able to predict eclipses several centuries before Europe could actually do the same. The northern half became known as Balhae, though there was arguments about the ethnic makeup of the area, whether the majority of the area was remnants of Goguryeo, or whether it was the Siberian people known as the Mohe, with the politics surrounding such not helping. Either way, they established close relationships with the barbarian dynasties of China, the Liao and the Jin, before being conquered by the rise of the Mongols. But this era comes to the end with the later Three Kingdoms era. Centralized, unified Syria began to collapse. leading to the territories that were captured to break away one by one, establishing the nations of Late Bokche and Tabong. These newly liberated territories then wasted no time in working to take their control back, working to conquer one another. One of the most interested in expanding was Taborg under the monk leader Guang Yi. However, he was unliked and was assassinated, and the new leader, Wang Jiao, established a new nation of Goryeo and conquered the other two nations, making this era only 40 years long. And so, by 938, Goryeo would be the first united Korea, and where the name Korea kind of comes from. You can see the similarities. Goryeo adopted the cultures of all three former kingdoms in part, creating a unified Korea culture that continued on. This was known as the Golden Age of Buddhism for Korea, with at times there being 70 temples in the capital alone. Throughout its existence, Goryeo continued to wrestle with its northern neighbors, working to reclaim lands formerly held by Goryeo. However, this eventually pitted them against the Yuan dynasty, who put the nation under Mongol control for about 100 years, then 30 years later placed them against the Ming. Literature and art flourished at this time in Korean history, and Goryeo adopted both technology from China as well as developed its own, most notably being a cutting edge with Navy artillery. Eventually, the leader of Goryeo tried to rally the people to take on the much stronger Ming army. He was quickly killed in a coup, and the dynasty was quickly replaced with the Joseon dynasty. Buddhism was quickly replaced with the more modern form of Confucianism, known as Neo-Confucianism. This led to both Buddhist persecution and the worst tyrants to commit what were known as literati purges, removing all intellectual enemies. After attacks from both Japan and the rising Qing Empire, Joseon closed down its borders, spending the next 200 years known as the Hermit Kingdom. The government was reformed, changing the system seen elsewhere, with 3 councillors, left, right, and chief, and 6 ministers of personal, taxation, rights, defense, justice, and commerce. They also established 3 offices for the Inspector General, the censors, and the special advisors. Debate and archery would become central to Korean culture. White porcelain, Korean literature, and music grew in the isolation, and the fact great emperors like Sengon the Great starred as great inventors led to the science being highly praised, and eventually led to inventions like the world's first bulletproof vest in the 1800s. Eventually, decline in the dynasty led to the rise of a Korean empire, but this only lasted a decade before Japan took them over in the year 1911. So, summation time. Ancient times are important to Korea, as it is always important to remember it. Ancient times are only known through pottery, then a great kingdom made by a man of legend, which then broke apart as their powerful neighbors moved in, ready to take land for themselves. Central to Korean history is the formation of 3 kingdoms, which for 100 years stood in balance until one gained the upper hand, uniting the area except part of the north for another 300 years. But then, as the winner themselves fell apart, all 3 kingdoms regained themselves for but a generation or 2, until Korea was finally fully united. dynasties will last through the Middle Ages and pre-modern era. In fact, the Joseon and its 500-year reign is longer than any other dynasty we'll be talking about this month. The first nation was a Buddhist golden age, and had great advances in ship and artillery, while it attempted to expand. Among others, well, the later was a Confucian utopia, which survived various invasions, shut itself off from the rest of the world, and outdid itself in the invention category, to the point of having inventions to last for a time against their industrial neighbors. But industrial Korea was not, and they were not scared by close calls like their neighbors China and Japan did, meaning when serious attempts of conquest came, they found themselves early in the 1900s as a colony. Which brings us to the end of this episode. 3 down and 1 left to go. Next week we finish this off with groups which are loosely tied together and which transcend a country. See you then.